Thank you, Chair. I've put my stopwatch on. Thank you all. First, I'd like to offer briefly regrets on behalf of the Chair of the Counter-Terrorism Committee of the UN Security Council, Ambassador Abulata, Permanent Representative of the Government of Egypt, that he was not able to join you here today. However, he's deeply impressed by this initiative of the India Foundation and was committed to being here. He sends you his warmest regards. I'd also like to express my own gratitude to the India Foundation for this invitation to speak before such an esteemed audience today. In the spirit of the title of this session, I'm going to take a little time to explain something about the role of my office, which is the Counter-Terrorism Committee Executive Directorate, the nature of its relations with India and the Indian Ocean region generally, which is significant, as well as a little bit more about the role of the United Nations generally. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, in 1996, the government of India took the important step of calling for a comprehensive counter-terrorism convention, something on which it continues to lead and to work towards to this day, in order, as the Honourable Chief Minister of Haryana so eloquently put it on Tuesday, to secure the global community against the scourge of terrorism. The comprehensive convention is an important goal. However, as UN member states continue to work towards it, to reach agreement on it, the United Nations has nevertheless been able to move forward and make great strides in assisting states to tackle global terrorism, even in its absence. How has this happened? Well, there are three ways. First of all, there is now a basket of conventions, 19 international instruments in all, that considered collectively, some consider it to be a form of a comprehensive approach to countering terrorism. They include conventions such as the Convention on Terrorist Bombings, the International Convention for the Suppression of Financing of Terrorism, and the Convention on Nuclear Terrorism. The Convention on Terrorist Financing even contains a definition, not of terrorism, but of a terrorist act. As Professor Gaynor said this morning, terrorism is a strategy, not a goal, and that has enabled member states to agree on a definition of an act of terrorism, which is that any act intended to cause death or serious bodily injury to a civilian or to any other person not taking part in the hostilities in a situation of armed conflicts, when the purpose of such act, by its nature or context, is to intimidate a population or to compel a government or an international organization to do or to abstain from doing any act. That's a legal basis on which the UN has been operating since 1999, when that convention, actually until it entered into force in 2002. It was opened for signature in 1999. So we do have that legal basis. Secondly, as Mr. Kimani mentioned, since 2006, the UN has had a global counterterrorism strategy adopted by the General Assembly and currently under review. It also has, pursuant to that strategy, the Counterterrorism Implementation Task Force, which brings together around 39 different agencies that have many and varied roles in tackling terrorism. In the broadest sense, Pillar 1 of the strategy instructs member states to consider the root causes of terrorism, particularly relevant to current considerations of how to prevent violent extremism. And this, in its broadest sense, includes UN agencies that would not normally be associated with CT, including UNESCO, UNICEF, and UNDP. Currently, that strategy is under review, and member states are considering establishing a high-level Undersecretary General position to give greater leadership on CT and to achieve better coordination and coherence. The new Secretary General has also promised to mainstream CT considerations into the work of the UN more generally. This is a move that we could scarcely have imagined even a few years ago. Third, there are the measures adopted by the Security Council, many of which have been adopted under Chapter 7 of the UN Charter, which makes them legally binding on all member states. They include the 1267 regime, which was first adopted in 1999, by which the Security Council imposes sanctions on individuals and entities linked to Al-Qaeda and Daesh. ISIL. It also includes the 1373 regime, which is the business of the Counterterrorism Committee, and which expects that member states impose national sanctions against individuals and entities linked to terrorism, including but not confined to Al-Qaeda and ISIL. I'm going into all this detail to give you, to show you that there is a very solid legal basis here for action. Resolution 1373 was adopted after 9/11. It lays out a very comprehensive set of measures and broad measures that states are required to implement. My office, CTED, was set up to support the work of that committee in its bilateral dialogue with each member state as it assessed each member state and their capacities for tackling counterterrorism. CTED has grown to become an independent assessment body staffed by members of the UN Secretariat. We have more than 12 years of assessment experience and a vast database documenting shortfalls and good practices. We've visited most member states, around 120 at the last count, many of them several times. We have a deep and ongoing dialogue with each state, including in many cases at the working level, directly with law enforcement officials, judges, prosecutors, and police officers. We have a strong focus on the IOR region, from East Africa to Southeast Asia, and of course, South Asia. We cover a broad range of CT measures, legislative frameworks, effective criminal justice systems, counter-terrorist financing, border control, law enforcement, human rights, and we work to ensure that this is all done with a respect for due process and rule of law. Increasingly, we've taken on the more cutting-edge topics. Internet and communications technologies, for example, has led us into discussions with the private sector and the consideration of public and private partnerships. This has been an intense work stream for us in the last 2 years. Again, one that we didn't actually predict would be as intense as it has become. In other areas, we've been working on preventing violent extremism and new ways of addressing threats. From the very start, the Counterterrorism Committee was wise enough to recognize that an office of 50 people wouldn't have the capacity to get very much done without international and regional partners, and with civil society implementing partners in many cases. So we have long-standing relationships with our friends at organizations like UNODC, Interpol, ICAO, IOM, IMO, all the acronyms. When we see the need for capacity building, we reach out to our implementing partners and make a referral. We even raise funds on behalf of our partners to have them deliver the required technical assistance pursuant to our recommendations. Where we see the need to facilitate further discussion of norms and standards, we can act as a catalyst to improve states' understanding of norms or even work with our partners to improve our standards. A good example of this is the work that we did on preventing terrorist abuse through Charities. Our assessments were showing that there needed to be more discussion around the subject, both to raise awareness of the risks and to introduce the concept of proportionate response to the risk. After all, the charitable sector is vulnerable to terrorist financing, but it's also worth billions of dollars a year globally, and its independent dynamism is an essential global force for good, one of the finest expressions of civil society in action. So just as we want to prevent its abuse from terrorist financiers, and that risk is a real one, we do not want it to suffer a chilling effect, either from heavy-handed preventative measures on the part of global financial institutions or from diminished resources from discouraged donors. We discussed with more than 80 states and over 100 charities some of these issues. We achieved not only what we set out to achieve, but it also led to greater engagement between the standards-setting Financial Action Task Force and the charitable sector itself, and in due course to a revision of good practices and the standards themselves. You'll be wondering about the recent example of the counterterrorism regime as framed by the United Nations, and that has been intense, just as the threat has expanded and become more complex. The Security Council CT regime has work to address the emerging threats. In the last 4 years, we've had an unprecedented number of thematic CT resolutions aimed at addressing such trends as the use of kidnapping and hostage-taking by terrorist groups, the foreign terrorist fighter phenomenon, and in particular, how to prevent cross-border travel for the purposes of terrorist acts, terrorist trade in cultural, religious, and scientific artifacts, issues related to gender and terrorism, internet and communications technologies, I already mentioned, new threats to civil aviation, the links between human trafficking and terrorism, and most recently in December, the need for enhanced international judicial and law enforcement cooperation. I'm going to skip to my regional section. Speaking now of the role of South Asia in the work of CTC, in terms of those emerging issues, trends, and developments that the Security Council has had to consider and that CTED has brought to its attention, possibly no other region has been more effective than South Asia in bringing those to the attention of CTED. The 8 countries of SAARC regularly bring their practitioners to the table to bring a real-world perspective to the work of the CTC and essentially advising CTED on what is needed. This is a unique role that member states have played, and we're deeply grateful to the 8 governments of the SAARC region for facilitating this and making it happen. So since 2009, judges, prosecutors, police officers of the 8 states have been meeting regularly at the practitioner level to discuss the challenges of effectively countering terrorism. These insights have informed and often guided the way in which CTED designs its assessments and facilitates technical assistance. Recent issues have included urgent concerns about the use of digital evidence and the digital transmission of evidence, interview and interrogation techniques, foreign terrorist fighters, and crucially, for countries like Afghanistan, whose criminal justice officials are under daily and serious threat of direct attack, the need to enhance the physical protection of criminal justice officers, as well as the victims and witnesses and victims of terrorism. This dialogue has led to a bilateral dialogue with countries outside the region, facilitated by CTED. Sri Lanka, for example, has been providing advice and guidance to one of the West African member states currently dealing with Boko Haram, based on its own experience with rehabilitation and reintegration techniques. This coming June, CTED will convene the 12th such regional workshop with the additional expertise of UNODC and Interpol. This process has been strongly supported over the long term by all the states of the region, as I've said, but was facilitated in particular by the government of India when Ambassador Hardeep Puri was chair of the CTC in 2011 and 2012. His dynamic leadership set the stage for prescient initiatives that still bear fruit to this day. He convened a special meeting of the CTC and in partnership with the Council of Europe in 2011, that considered for the first time the practical measures that states were taking and could take to counter incitement to terrorism and to prevent the violent extremism that could incite and inspire terrorist acts. Some 5 years later, these themes and many of the solutions considered in that meeting are still cutting-edge issues and about to be mainstreamed into the work of the UN as a whole. Ladies and gentlemen, the need to act continues to be urgent, and it's warranted by the regional and international nature of the threat today. Horrific attacks in all regions, and no less in the Indian Ocean region, demonstrate that no states or citizens are insulated from the threat of terrorism. This is true even if the perpetrators are motivated by events that are geographically distant from the locus of their attacks. Meetings such as this conference, convened by the India Foundation, are a vital part of a broader effort by states and civil society to address a threat that continues to fuel armed conflict and the illicit trade in goods and services, undermines efforts to promote good governance, and erodes the civil and human rights of citizens. States in the region have made great strides in their efforts to address the terrorist scourge. Yet we know that no state can successfully address this threat alone, and that all tools, diplomatic, military, and political, are often necessary to ensure a sustainable victory. We at the United Nations stand ever ready and willing to serve and support those efforts. Thank you very much.